Hello everyone. Welcome back to our shopping cart series in React and TypeScript. In our last video, we delved into useReducer for managing complex state logic. Today, we are taking another significant step by introducing and understanding the useContext hook, and we'll also implement that in our application. This powerful hook allows us to share state and dispatch functions across our entire component tree without the hassle of prop drilling. By the end of this video, you'll understand what useContext is, why it is essential, and how to implement it effectively with TypeScript. Let's get started. So first, let's have a look at our app structure. So in this app structure, we can see we have our application at the top level, and then there is app component. That app component would be pulling in your router and doing some other initializations. So for example, in previous video, we saw that we implemented useReducer hook in one of the listing page, passed it down to product tile using the prop. Since now the state that we have declared in our useReducer would be used across the application, so header would also need it to show the number of products that are in cart. Then your listing page, product tile, and similarly, for example, an add to cart button that we create, if it needs access to that, without context, how we would go about is we would have to use prop drilling. And how does prop drilling look like in terms of your component tree? So here we can see we will initialize the useReducer in your app component. And then from the app component, we create a new prop in your product listing page and pass down the property, the dispatch method and the state down to your product listing page. Then we again create another prop in your product tile, same dispatch and state which we received from app component to product listing gets passed down to product tile. And then again, the same thing gets created in the add to cart button, and then product tile passes is down to add to cart button. And if you have additional components below the tree, it would have to be passed so on. So this entire process of passing the components using props is called prop drilling. And the larger your component tree, the more inefficient this way of passing props is. Because what happens if you need to pass another global method from your app component to this one? You create another property, and then that same property gets passed down the tree, which is not very scalable and maintainable, and tightly couples your products and component structure with one another. So for this, we need to use context. Now, what is use context? Use context is a hook that allows you to share values such as state, functions, or any object that you define across your component tree without passing props manually at every level. Think of it as a way to create global variable that can be accessed by any component, making state management more efficient and our code a lot cleaner. So this will become a lot clearer when we dive into the implementation. But let's have a look at our updated component tree, how it would look like. So this is what the initial state looks like with the prop drilling. And when we introduce a context, we would be providing that context at the app component level. So under app component, now you see a new provider comes into picture. That would be the CartContext provider. Same is the case with reducers. As you can have multiple reducers in your application, you can also have multiple providers in your application, one for each reducer, or you can club multiple reducers into one provider as well. So that is also one of the very established development pattern in React. But right now, as we can see, under app component, now we will have the CartContext provider that is wrapping our entire application. And now whichever component needs access to anything from this cart context, for example, I need access to dispatch method whenever I'm clicking on add to cart button so that I can dispatch the add to cart action and update my state accordingly. In that case, we can see this add to cart button can directly reach out to your cart context provider and get the required state. So no need to tightly couple your components with props and others, but the component themselves can reach out to the context provider and get the required values whenever they need. And this usage of use context eliminates the need for prop drilling by providing a way to share state and functions directly within any component that needs them. Now, with this, let's dive into the implementation. But before that, we will see where do we stand in our application, what we have covered so far, and how you can get access to the starting project so you can code alongside. So far in our application, we've done, we've created the reducer. So here we can see we defined a cart state, a type of state that we will be updating. Then we define the various actions that we'll have in our cart state or the reducer. So you can have add to cart, updating the quantity, and remove from cart. After that, we created the reducer to handle the various actions that are coming in and update the state accordingly. In our product list page, we implemented the use reducer, and here we can see we implemented use reducer and then created a new prop in our product tile. So here we created a new prop dispatch where we are consuming the dispatch method, and on click of add to cart, we are calling this method, trigger the action of add to cart, and we are able to see the items added onto the screen. So we created this use effect to log and see the values. If you were developing alongside, you would already have all of this set up and running on your machine. If not, I will be adding a link to the starting project in the description. Please download the starting project. You would have to run the npm install command once in the life cycle of the project, and then with npm start, you will be able to run this entire project in the state that we see right now. Let's have a look at the running application and the logs that we generate. Server in my case is already running on port 3000. I'll minimize it, and here is our application. And as we can see, if I click on add to cart on any of these items, the items are getting added to state. So you see item with ID 1 was added, item with ID 3 would also be added. Here we have. And if we click on add to cart multiple times for any of these items, I clicked on it 4 times. So now it did not add the product 4 times, but instead it would have updated the quantity by 4. So 1 for the initial add, and then if I click 4 times, the quantity gets updated to 5. And all of this is already implemented in our application. Now let's go ahead and start creating the context. For that, inside context, let's create a new file, CartContext.tsx. First, let's have a look at CartReducer and export this interface. And in here, let's create the cart context is equals to, you need to use create context coming from React. And in here, this would take the type definition and the initial value, which would be undefined for now. This is really important. Now, one of the values will definitely be undefined. And then you have your state, which would be of type cart state. And then you would have your dispatch method, which would be of type react.dispatch of type cart action. So why are we creating of this type? Because if you look at the product listing page where we created the use reducer instance, we see we have this state and dispatch coming out of our use reducer hook, and this state and dispatch is the one which we want to share across our component tree. So we are creating a new context which is compatible with the state and dispatch prop type and will allow us to put this value, the initialized value, in the context and share it across our application. So with this, your context is created. Let's try and implement that. And then we will come back to this component and implement all the best practices associated with this and also talk about them, why they are needed. So now for this, we will open our app.tsx and we will move the logic to initialize the reducer from your product list page to your app component. We'll take this off as well. So first thing would definitely be in your app.component, we need to ensure we initialize our reducer and we take the state updates and we put them here as well. Let's remove anything that we are not using here. This looks okay. And dispatch also we will remove for now. So let's clean up the dispatch, and inside your product tile, remove the dispatch from property, but let it be here for now. We'll just comment this out. We will fetch this again from the context. Okay. So it's cleaned up and it won't throw any errors as of now, but we still need to add the appropriate imports here. Use reducer from React, cart reducer, initial state. Then you have your use effect coming from React. And now we will wrap our entire application in the provider. How do we do that? So first would be cart context. I think we forgot to export it. Let's go ahead and export this. So now cart context is exported. Cart context, import this, and then provider. This will take a value. And what is the value that we need to pass? It is an object which contains a state and which contains a dispatch. And then move your component inside. So here, now we are not getting any error. We have cleaned up our components. We've removed the useReducer completely from here, removed the dispatch prop from our product tile, and also removed the passing method. And now we are wrapping our entire application in the CartContext provider using the CartContext that we just created in our CartContext.tsx. All good till now? One thing which is remaining is in here, we still need access to this dispatch method. And how do we get it is we will create a new constant where we will get access to this context that we have just created. And for this, we need access to useContextHook coming from React. Now this will ask us which context do you need access to? And we need access to our CartContext. And now we can see context, if available, it can either be undefined or it will have the values of state and dispatch. So here we can uncomment this line, and if context is available, then we will call the dispatch method on it. So we don't need props anymore. By accessing the context by using the useContextHook, you're able to get access to the values which are set in the context. And what are the values that we are setting into the context? It's the state and dispatch that we get after initializing the useReducer. And the type of this would be your cart state and a react.dispatch, which can dispatch cart actions. Now let's check our application. There shouldn't be any change in the experience. You should still see the same log state was updated, but now coming from app.tsx. All right. So here we have our application. And just one call out here. Ensure that the casing of the file is correct across all. So in case if your file is named in a separate case than the one you're importing with, for example, it's an uppercase and you import it using lowercase or some other casing, you could run into some import errors. So if you see them, React will clearly call them out, just fix them. But it should not happen if you're using auto imports. But here we can see. Now I'll click on add to cart for two products, and we see our state gets updated with these two products, and now the log is coming from app.tsx. So without using props and prop drilling, now we are able to access this dispatch method inside our component tree in the product file. Now let's refactor the code a little more to ensure that it's even more streamlined. Now we can see that whenever we want to use a context, we need to ensure that we create a provider. When we are calling the provider, we need to ensure that we pass the values, else you will not get any values. You will get the initial value, which would be undefined. So this is where it's picking the value from. So since this is a normal calling pattern for a provider, the best way would be to create a React component that wraps your entire application, all the child nodes that we pass, and takes away the initialization logic for the context as well. So this entire logic that we see be taken away in a separate provider. So let's take it out. I'll copy this and I'll create export const cart context provider. And this would be of type functional component coming from React. And this would have children, which would be of type React elements. And here in this function, we'll just paste everything, import the required use effect and other hooks that we need access to. And now wherever we are using app routes, we will instead use the children which are available. So we'll use the children node. That way, now your application can use this component, and this component is now responsible for all the initialization logic. And let's update our application, make it even more simple. Wherever we were using this, now we will use cart context provider. Close this up, move your app routes inside, clean up the closing tag, and add the required import. And now we don't need to initialize it here. We do not need these state updates here. A lot cleaner app component, a lot leaner. And now your context related component is also available here. And again, we go back to our application. There won't be any change. I'll refresh. You see, I'm clicking on add to cart. It added all the three products, and the cart context is still available inside the product tile. Now we can take this refactoring one step further. So we can see that we are using use context providing the cart context. But what happens when you don't wrap your application in cart context? So for that, I'll just comment out the provider. Go back to our application, refresh, and you see I'm clicking on add to cart, but nothing happens. And I'm not getting an error as well. So I'm trying to get access to context, but since we are not wrapping our application into the context provider, we don't see any discernible error in the component, and these sort of issues get a little trickier to debug and understand. To avoid these, what we can do, we can also ensure that whenever we need access to our card context, we use a custom hook instead of our use context hook. And this can be done using export const use card context. And this hook will internally do the exact same thing. Get access to context, const context is equals to use context coming from React, and I need access to card context, we are telling. But with an additional layer of safety. If context is not available, in that case, throw new error, and if it is available, so if not, we are throwing a new error, else we are returning context. And now wherever we were using the use context of and passing card context, instead of this, we will just use card context. So very straightforward way of implementing it and using it, and also removes a lot of ambiguity from your code. Now, if we go back to our application, you see, you get the error right away. To use card context, please wrap the application in card context provider. And these are the sort of things that we should really put in our application to ensure that the developers who are using our application understand what they need to do when they need to do it. And with this, now when I re-enable this provider, the error would go away and we'll be able to see the entire application. And here we can see, I'll refresh. We see there's no error. You still have access to your card context, dispatch, and everything. And it works wonderfully. So a lot of things we did in this video. Let's summarize the changes. We already had reducer and we did not alter anything in this file. What we did, we created a new file inside our context called CartContext.tsx because we are exporting the tsx files from here. And let me just update my prettier config a little. It could be a little hard for you to understand. Let me just add a custom configuration here. So prettier RC, and in this, we can add print width to 120. I'm increasing this only as of now. We can add additional configurations later. But now when I save, you see, this is much more concise. It allows much wider area to be coded in. So that's what print width would do. Since I'm using Prettier plugin, you can also add this custom configuration, and you can add line width which is compatible to your screen size. So we do not want a horizontal scroll to come in when you're writing the code, and that's where this print width come into picture. But for us, since we are working on a slightly larger monitor, you can adjust it accordingly. I'll close this, and with this, now we can see in our card context, we created a new context called card context. This is created by using the create context coming from React, and we provide the appropriate type definition. So this takes in the type definition using generics, and here we provided that it will, when defined, have a state and a dispatch method, which would be of type cart state, and a dispatch method which is capable of dispatching cart actions, or it will be undefined. And we initialize this as undefined. Then we created a provider because whenever you are creating a context, you always need to provide values to it and wrap this in your component tree. This is what we are using to wrap in our component tree. We created a custom component, functional component, which initializes your useReducer. We added a use effect just for clarity. In future sessions, when we implement it across our components, we will remove this when we have visual indicators plugged in. And then you created this provider, which will wrap your children. Whatever children nodes are provided will be wrapped up into this card context provider. And inside these childrens, which are there in your component tree, you would need access to the state and dispatch methods or access to context. And for that, we created a custom hook, which is called useCartContext. This initializes the context and checks. If you forgot to wrap your application in card context provider, it will throw a proper error that, okay, context is not defined because you forgot to wrap this in card context provider. Because it's our card context provider, which is taking care of initializing and providing the initial values. So definitely you forgot to wrap this in. So please wrap it. And once you wrap it, you will get the access to context. And that's exactly what we are doing. In our product tile, we cleaned up the method. And in here, I'll save it once again. And here we can see, now we are getting access to use card context. And since this one would always be defined now, we can destructure the dispatch method and use dispatch directly. And your application works exactly the same. So now only two places where you would have to make changes is your app, where you're putting the provider that we created in CartContext, and in the components where you want to consume these contexts using useCartContext. So now our product list page is now independent of the reducer logic. And if this needs access to state, again, it can do the exactly same thing. So const use cart context, and it can tell I need access to state, and you can get access to state, and this can start consuming state right away from here itself. And that's how it makes it really easy for us to centralize the entire consumption of the context, ensure that we don't have to use prop drilling for everything. So in terms of best practices recap, we need to have the proper type declaration for type safety. So that way you get proper auto completion when the values are defined. Create custom hooks to access your cart context. You create an appropriate provider so that you don't have to keep doing this cart context.provider whenever you need access to this. And also you are in control of the initialization logic, not the component that is implementing this. If you do not provide this, then wherever they're providing cart context.provider, the developer would be able to initialize and pass in the values, and they could do something wrong. But this way you control the initialization logic and the values that you'll get with the context. And then provider placement is really important. So we can wrap our entire application or a subsection of your application as well, where this would be relevant. In case of very large applications, you might not need an entire context provider for the entire tree of your application. You would only need it, for example, a shopping cart provider for the shopping cart screen or the shopping cart set of components. And that's how you can wrap it selectively as well. And then all the components which are under this provider would be able to consume this using use cart context. And with this, it's a wrap on mastering the use context in React and Typescript. We've learned how to set up a context provider, create custom hook for easy access, and integrate useReducer for robust state management, all while maintaining the type safety and the best practices that are associated. By leveraging use context with your useReducer, the applications can achieve very efficient and scalable state management without the complexities of prop drilling. This setup not only makes our code cleaner, but also enhances maintainability as our project grows. In the next video, we'll continue building on this foundation and we'll start implementing the cart related updates on our application. So now we'll start putting in product tiles on our cart page and see whenever we are adding our product to the cart, we'll be able to see it in the cart section of our component. If you find this tutorial helpful, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment with any questions or any problems that you're facing during implementation. And I'll try to cover those as a part of our future implementations in detailed videos so that we all build a better foundation. Thank you for watching. Happy coding.